This is a video for anybody who's learning Spanish and is interested in narrative storytelling. This could be reading or writing fiction. This could be reading or writing biographies, historical narratives, right? If you're interested in that, this is a video for you. The structure we're talking about is going to be called the future in the past conditional tense. It's not the best name, but it's not very discussed. It's not commonly discussed, and so I couldn't find a perfect name for it. The one entry I found about it on Wikipedia called it the future in the past tense. I'm adding the word conditional because we're going to be using conditionally conjugated verbs to express this idea. But it's called the future in the past conditional tense. And if that doesn't make sense, I am hoping by the end of the video that it will. To start, we need to understand what conditional verbs are. Normally, a conditional verb in English is when you have a verb and you add the word would before it, the auxiliary verb would. So if I have the sentence, if I won $1 million, I would buy a boat. The condition is the if I won $1 million. It's this hypothetical condition, and the would is expressing the result of that condition, right? So that's why we call it the conditional tense, this would buy. I would buy a boat. In Spanish, the conditional conjugation of a verb is not the same. We don't have an auxiliary verb like would. Rather, the verb is conjugated with specific suffixes at the end. So if we take the verb comer, to eat, you might say, yo comería, tú comerías, él, ella, usted comería, nosotros comeríamos, ustedes comerían, right? This is the most common structure for conjugating a verb in the conditional tense. There are a couple of outliers where you don't take the infinitive and add that suffix, but rather you change the infinitive and then add the same suffix, but that suffix will always be the same. Even if you haven't learned how to conjugate verbs in the conditional tense, you've probably learned a couple of phrases already, like me gustaría, me encantaría, I would like, I would love. Both of these very common phrases are using verbs conjugated in the conditional tense. Gustar becomes gustaría, encantar becomes encantaría. Now, this video is not going to be about expressing the result clauses of conditional ideas. However, we are going to still be using these conditional verbs, but we're going to be expressing a completely different idea. It is so far from the original idea, but for whatever reason, in English and in Spanish both, it still works exactly the same. So, the future in the past conditional. We are going to be using a conditionally conjugated verb to express this idea. And the idea that we're going to be expressing is a narrative style of idea. So it has to do with storytelling. Basically, what we're going to be expressing is from the perspective of the writer of a story or the teller of a story. You are talking about a character or perhaps even yourself, and you are expressing a knowledge of the future that the character, even if that character is you yourself, does not have at the point of time that you are talking about in the story. That might sound very weird, but I promise you, you have experienced this structure before. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to show you a clip from the movie Stranger Than Fiction.
His watch suddenly stopped. Harold's watch thrust him into the immitigable path of fate. Little did he know that this simple, seemingly innocuous act would result in his imminent death.
What? What?
Little did he know that this simple, seemingly innocuous act would result in his imminent death. We can see that the verb result is being conjugated in the conditional tense, would result. But we're not expressing that same idea that we were talking about before, the counterfactual conditional idea, the hypothetical idea, because we're not saying this simple, seemingly innocuous act would result in his imminent death if a certain condition were met. That's not what we're expressing, right? We're not trying to express a hypothetical idea. Rather, the narrator, who is narrating this character's life in his head, the narrator is expressing future knowledge of what is going to happen or what this character is going to do relative to that character's point in time right now. So the narrator is speaking from the perspective of the future, from an omniscient perspective. This is why this structure is so common in narrative, in fiction, and in biographies. And I'm going to show you two examples of this structure working exactly the same way in Spanish. And my first example is going to be from fictional narrative. My second example is going to be from a historical biography, so we can really get the hang of it. The first example comes from the book En Agosto Nos Vemos by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. A little bit of a spoiler alert, I'm only going to talk about the first chapter. In the first chapter of this book, the main character, Anna, goes on a trip to an island to go visit the remains of her mother who is buried there. But on this trip, she meets a man, and she ends up going home with him. And for the first time in her marriage, at the very end of the chapter, she has an affair. The second chapter starts with the very first sentence being, Nunca más volvería a ser la misma. Nunca más volvería a ser la misma. She would never again return to being the same. We can see that the verb of this that the main verb of this sentence, volvería, is being conjugated in the conditional tense, volver. If you're interested, by the way, in case this doesn't totally make sense the way that the sentence is laid out, the author could have said, Nunca más sería la misma. She would never be the same, but he's using this verb, volver a, which is used to express like to do something again, to return to doing something. Nunca más volvería a ser la misma. She would never again return to being the same. We know that the author is not trying to express a normal conditional idea. He's not trying to say she would never again be the same person if a certain condition were met. We know that that's not what he's trying to express. Rather, he's trying to express from the perspective of the future, or you might say, because this is fiction, the perspective of omniscience. He's trying to express the inevitability of this, right? Although the character has just experienced something and is now living in the immediate aftermath of that, she does not realize that she will never again be the same after this life-changing experience. But the author is expressing the inevitability of it by saying she would never again be the same person. He could have said, Nunca más volvió a ser la misma. She never returned to being the same again. And we might be expressing a similar idea, a similar core idea, but using this conditional tense, she never again would be the same person, is hitting harder the inevitability of it, right? It's why I love this structure, and it's so interesting to me. And my second example, like I said, is going to be historical, right? Historical narrative. So this comes from a biography. I had to write it down because it's kind of long. It comes from a biography of Rómulo Gallegos, who was the first ever democratically elected president of Venezuela. Didn't last very long. And he also was a very famous author, after whom there is actually a literary prize named, the Rómulo Gallegos. This author is writing about Rómulo Gallegos right now and is talking about something that he did. I'll just give you the example here. Al año siguiente se inscribió en la Universidad de Caracas para estudiar leyes, pero se retiró el mismo año para dedicarse a lo que sería la pasión de su vida, la escritura. If we were to translate this idea as syntactically as possible, we would be saying that he started in the University of Caracas to study law, but that same year he took himself out of university to dedicate himself to what would be the passion of his life, writing. I'm using would be because the author of this biography chose to conjugate the verb ser as sería, which is the conditional tense of sería. But in the same ideas we've been talking about before, the author is not trying to express a normal conditional idea. They are not trying to express he took himself out of college to dedicate himself to what would be the passion of his life if a certain condition had been met. That's not what we're doing here. Rather, we are expressing a certain inevitability in the narrative of this story, right? Even though this is historical, this is not fiction, I'm not going to say that the author is expressing this inevitability from a perspective of omniscience, but you might say at least they are expressing the inevitability of this decision from a perspective of the future relative to the character's point in time in the past. Even though this character is not fictional, this character is historical. So if it didn't make sense at the beginning of the video, I hope that it's starting to make sense right now why I'm calling this idea the future in the past conditional tense. And I think the best way to practice this structure and fortify the idea in your mind is write a novel in Spanish and leave it down in the comments.